Rising prices could be a good thing, could make the US money. Well, the prices are certainly going up. The price of Brent Crude closed tonight at more than $100 a barrel. The first time in over 4 years the markets have ended their day at this level. And our deputy economics editor, Dashini David, has more on all of this.
They're off the coast of Iraq. That's as the International Energy Agency says it plans to release hundreds of millions of barrels. But analysts say the move will not fully offset supply disruptions tied to the conflict affecting oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz. They add it's unlikely to bring much relief at the pump.
Something unprecedented happened on February 28, 2026, and the world is still trying to process what comes next. In the span of a single night, the Middle East changed forever. A man who had held absolute power over Iran for decades was dead. A military operation unlike anything seen in modern history had just begun, and somewhere in the Persian Gulf, the clock was already ticking on what analysts would later call the most consequential energy crisis of the 21st century. But here's what nobody was talking about in those first chaotic hours. The real weapon Iran was preparing to use wasn't a missile. It wasn't a drone. It was a narrow strip of water, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and whoever controlled it controlled the fate of the global economy. This is what happened. On March 12, 2026, Iran's newly appointed Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, issued a declaration that sent shockwaves through every trading floor, every government war room, and every fuel station from Los Angeles to London. Speaking through Iranian state television, he announced that the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed to Western traffic, not temporarily, not as a negotiating chip, closed indefinitely. The response from energy markets was immediate and brutal. Brent Crude, the global benchmark for oil prices, crossed $100 per barrel the very next day. West Texas Intermediate, the American standard, hit $95.29. In a single week, the average price of gasoline across the United States jumped 48 cents, reaching $3.63 per gallon. In California, drivers were already staring at $5.34 at the pump. But those numbers, alarming as they are, only tell part of the story. Because when you look at what flows through the Strait of Hormuz every single day, the full scale of what just happened becomes terrifyingly clear. Approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply passes through that narrow channel. Every barrel of crude shipped from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, the way, and Iran itself moves through those waters, close the strait, and you don't just spike energy prices. You begin to unravel the logistics of the entire global economy. To understand how we got here, you have to go back 12 days, back to the night of February 28th. Operation Epic Fury, a joint American and Israeli military campaign, began in the early hours of that morning. What unfolded over the next 12 hours was, according to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the most significant joint U.S.-Israeli military action in recorded history. Approximately 900 strikes were executed within that window alone. The targets were precise and deliberate: Iran's missile production infrastructure, its naval capabilities, its nuclear program. The United States deployed B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, each carrying the most powerful conventional weapon in America's arsenal, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, known as the Bunker Buster 14. Of those bombs were dropped on Iran's most fortified nuclear sites, Fordo and Natanz, facilities buried deep underground specifically to survive exactly this kind of attack. B-52 Stratofortresses provided additional strike capability, targeting command and control posts and missile launch infrastructure. U.S. Central Command confirmed on their official channels that American air power struck Iranian command and control posts within the first 100 hours of the operation. And then, amid the chaos and fire of that opening night, came the development that would define everything that followed. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran for more than 3 decades, was killed. The man who had spent his entire tenure positioning Iran as the central axis of resistance against American and Israeli influence in the Middle East was gone. The theological and political architecture he had built, the networks, the proxy forces, the nuclear ambitions, all of it now sat in a sudden, dangerous vacuum. The question the world immediately began asking was simple: who fills that vacuum? And what did they do next? The answer came on March 9th, and it was not reassuring. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain supreme leader, was confirmed as Iran's new supreme leader. The appointment was swift by any political standard, and it carried an obvious symbolic weight. Iran was not signaling retreat, it was signaling succession, continuity, defiance. President Trump responded to the appointment directly. He called it, in his words, a big mistake. The White House, through Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, reaffirmed that American objectives included razing the Iranian missile industry to the ground. Those words landed in Tehran with predictable effect. On March 11th, Mojtaba Khamenei gave his first official statement as supreme leader. It was not a call for diplomacy. He declared that the Strait of Hormuz would remain blocked and promised what he described as crushing blows against the United States Fifth Fleet, the American naval command headquartered in Bahrain, which sits just miles from the strait itself. Iranian state media had already been reporting that the Irg Navy was placing the Fifth Fleet headquarters in their targeting calculations. Reuters confirmed that Iran's naval forces had been positioning explosive-laden boats near tanker routes and actively mining patrol corridors through the strait. The message was unmistakable. Iran was preparing for a prolonged economic war. But the energy crisis had already begun before Mojtaba Khamenei's formal declaration. It started in Qatar. On March 2nd, just 4 days after the opening strikes of Operation Epic Fury, Iranian drones struck the Ras Laffan industrial city in Qatar. This is not just any facility. Ras Laffan is the nerve center of global liquefied natural gas production. Qatarnergy, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, operates its entire export Infrastructure from this site, Qatar supplies LNG to Europe, Japan, South Korea, and dozens of other nations that depend on it for electricity generation and heating. The Qatar Ministry of Defense confirmed the drone strikes and described the subsequent production halt as a precautionary measure to protect infrastructure. But precautionary or not, the effect was the same. Qatari LNG exports stopped. The consequences rippled instantly. European and Asian natural gas futures surged by more than 50%. In some markets, the spike was closer to 70%. For European nations that had spent years reducing their dependence on Russian natural gas following the war in Ukraine, the Qatari shutdown was catastrophic news. The European Union moved swiftly to seek a pause in its methane regulations, effectively acknowledging that energy security had overtaken environmental policy as the continent's primary concern. Energy Secretary Chris Wright announced on March 11 that the United States would release 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That same day, the International Energy Agency, in a unanimous decision among its member nations, approved a coordinated global release of 400 million barrels, the largest emergency oil release in the history of the organization. IEA Executive Director Fatih Birol described the action as major. He noted that global energy supply had effectively fallen by approximately 20% following the Strait closure and the Qatari shutdown, but he was careful to add something that cut through any optimism the release announcement might have generated. He said, and this is worth listening to closely, that the most important thing for stable energy flows is the resumption of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, releasing hundreds of millions of barrels from emergency reserves can slow the bleeding. It cannot stop it, not if the strait stays closed. The mathematics are simply too overwhelming. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly 20 million barrels of oil per day. Even a release of 400 million barrels stretched across weeks or months cannot compensate for the daily hemorrhage of supply that a sustained blockade creates. The emergency reserves buy time. They do not solve the problem. Japan moved quickly within the IEA framework, confirming the release of 15 days of private sector reserves alongside 30 days of government reserves. G7 nations broadly signaled support for proactive measures to address the price spike. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, was attempting to reroute crude exports through Red Sea pipelines, an alternative path that bypasses the strait entirely. But as the National reported, industry analysts warned of catastrophic consequences if the strait remained shut for an extended period. The Red Sea pipeline network simply does not have the capacity to absorb the volume that the strait normally handles. It is a partial workaround, not a solution. The economic danger signals are now flashing at multiple levels simultaneously. At the pump, Americans are already feeling the pressure. Patrick DeHaan of GasBuddy, one of the most closely followed fuel price analysts in the country, posted on the day of the spike that the 48-cent weekly jump in gas prices represented what he called a massive jolt to the logistics, trucking, and agriculture sectors. Diesel prices had surged by 23%, and DeHaan emphasized that the downstream effects on supply chains, food distribution, and fertilizer costs could not be overstated. That last point, the fertilizer connection, matters more than most people realize. Modern fertilizer production is deeply tied to natural gas prices. As LNG markets spike, fertilizer costs rise. As fertilizer costs rise, farmers face higher input costs. Those costs get passed down the supply chain to grocery stores, and ultimately, to consumers. Economists are already projecting a 10% increase in food prices by the end of March if current energy market conditions persist. The broader economic warnings are coming from multiple directions now. Gregory Dako, chief economist at Parthenon, is projecting that monthly inflation could hit 1% in March alone, which would be the highest single-month reading in 4 years. RSM analysts have identified a specific threshold that is drawing significant attention in economic circles. They calculate that if oil reaches $125 per barrel, U.S. GDP growth would decline by 0.8%. Bloomberg has been even more direct in its framing, describing that same price level as the economic Armageddon threshold, the point at which a global recession becomes not just possible but likely. Brent Crude is currently sitting just above $100 per barrel. That leaves a gap of $25 between where the market is now and where economists say the floor falls out from under the global economy. $25 in a market that moved 40% in 2 weeks. The military picture is equally unresolved and in some ways more alarming. The Pentagon's initial assessment of the damage done to Iran's nuclear program is significant but carefully worded. Officials have concluded that Iran's nuclear capabilities have been set back but not eliminated. The bunker-busting strikes on Fordo and Natanz caused severe damage to facilities that were specifically engineered to withstand conventional attack. But the Iranian program is dispersed, and dispersal is itself a defensive strategy. Destroying known sites does not mean destroying undisclosed ones. More importantly, the Pentagon assessment identifies a strategic pivot underway inside Iran. Military analysts believe Iran is moving deliberately toward what they're calling asymmetric economic warfare. The nuclear program was always partly a deterrent, partly a bargaining chip. The Strait of Hormuz is something different. It is a lever, and Iran has now pulled it. President Trump made the American military objectives explicit in a statement delivered on March 2nd. He said the goal was destroying Iran's missile capabilities, annihilating their navy, and ensuring that what he called the world's #1 sponsor of terror can never obtain a nuclear weapon. Those are broad and sweeping objectives. Achieving all three while Iran simultaneously executes an asymmetric economic campaign involving maritime warfare, drone strikes on allied infrastructure, and a strait blockade is a substantially different challenge than the opening air campaign suggested. The regional escalation risk is real, and intelligence analysts are watching it closely. Mojtaba Khamenei, in his March 11th statements, made references that experts interpreted as signals about other fronts: Iran's strategic relationships with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, and various militia networks in Iraq represent what analysts describe as a ready-made toolkit for expanding the conflict beyond Iranian territory. If Iran cannot win a direct military confrontation with the United States and Israel, it can attempt to raise the cost of that confrontation by activating proxy networks across the region. Lebanon would draw in Israel on a northern front simultaneously with the ongoing southern pressure. Yemen's Houthi forces have already demonstrated their willingness and ability to strike shipping in the Red Sea, which is exactly the alternative route Saudi Arabia is now trying to use to bypass the strait. Iraq's militia network sit astride critical infrastructure corridors and near American military installations. The scenario where this conflict stays contained within Iranian borders is already under significant pressure. And beneath all of it runs the question that has defined American and Israeli strategic thinking about Iran for 25 years. The nuclear question. The Pentagon says the program has been set back, but intelligence agencies have a mixed record on the precise state of Iran's nuclear capabilities at any given moment, if Iran retains the knowledge, the personnel, and even partial infrastructure. A program that is set back is not a program that is ended. The assassination of Ali Khamenei removed a known quantity from the equation. His son Mojtaba is less known, less predictable, and operating under conditions of maximum pressure and maximum domestic expectation. A new Supreme Leader who closes the strait, threatens the Fifth Fleet, and promises crushing blows in his first public statement is a leader who has made his positioning clear. What that positioning looks like when placed under sustained military pressure, diplomatic isolation, and economic collapse inside Iran is a question no intelligence service on Earth can currently answer with confidence. The energy markets are watching every development in real time. Traders are pricing in risk that extends weeks and months into the future. The IEA's emergency release was designed to signal that governments are engaged and that supply is not about to disappear. But markets do not operate on signals alone, they operate on fundamentals. And the fundamental reality right now is that 20% of the world's daily oil supply is inaccessible because a 21-mile-wide strait is being controlled by a country engaged in active hostilities with the world's most powerful military. Energy Secretary Chris Wright confirmed that the United States has arranged to replace the 172 million barrels from the SPAR with 200 million barrels over the next year. That replacement process assumes, by definition, that global oil markets will normalize, that tankers will move, that the strait will reopen, that the current crisis will resolve. Every one of those assumptions is currently in question. 400 million barrels, the largest coordinated emergency energy release in human history, and the man who approved it on the international side, IEA Director Fatih Birol, immediately told the world that it would not be enough if the Strait of Hormuz does not reopen. That single sentence carries the weight of everything that happens next. The military campaign that started on February 28 achieved its most dramatic visible objective. Ali Khamenei is dead. Iran's nuclear facilities have been struck. The IRG's conventional military capacity has taken serious damage. By any traditional measure of a military operation, the opening phase of Operation Epic Fury performed at a level that drew descriptions of historical significance from defense analysts. But war is rarely decided in its opening phase, and the phase that follows the opening strikes has already revealed a strategic complication that no amount of air power can bomb away. The Strait of Hormuz is not a military installation, it is geography. You cannot destroy it, you can only control it, contest it, or negotiate your way through it. And right now, the entity claiming control is a new government in Tehran that has staked its legitimacy on defiance. Mojtaba Khamenei does not have the decades of authority his father accumulated. He does not have the same institutional relationships, the same theological standing, the same established networks of loyalty throughout the Iranian system. What he does have is a crisis, a war, and an audience inside Iran that is watching to see whether the son is as resolute as the father. Backing down, opening the strait, extending any form of accommodation to Washington while American bombs are still falling on Iranian soil would be a devastating signal for a supreme leader who has been in office for less than 2 weeks. The political logic of defiance is almost unavoidable from his position, and that political logic playing out in Tehran is what is driving oil prices in New York, gas prices in California, grocery projections in every major economy, and the strategic calculations of every government from Tokyo to Berlin. The world spent decades building an energy infrastructure that runs through 21 miles of contested water. That infrastructure is now the central variable in a military conflict with no defined endpoint, no active diplomatic channel, and two parties whose stated objectives cannot currently coexist. The United States says Iran must not have nuclear weapons and that its missile and naval capabilities must be destroyed. Iran says the strait stays closed and the Fifth Fleet is a target. Both statements were made in the last 2 weeks, neither has been walked back. The question that nobody in Washington, Tel Aviv, Brussels, Tokyo, or Riyadh can currently answer, the question that energy traders are pricing in with every bid and offer, the question that grocery chains are building into their supply projections, and the question that will define the geopolitical landscape of 2026 is a deceptively simple one. How does this end? And perhaps more urgently, who blinks first when the price of not blinking is a global recession?